Hello, everyone, and welcome to the medDesign podcast, where we explore the journeys of medical innovators. Today, we're honored to have Laurence Freeman as our guest. Laurence is the CEO of Oakbay LLC, an intellectual property commercialization and business development company focusing on healthcare innovation. With years of international experience, he's been instrumental in advancing groundbreaking healthcare products in fields such as medical devices, digital health, public health solutions, and pharmaceutical nanotechnology. His involvement in various ventures, including D-Cubed Technologies and Cube Medical Innovations, has provided him with a unique perspective on the intersection of data science, AI, and healthcare innovation. In addition to his entrepreneurial pursuits, Laurence is also an adjunct professor of healthcare innovation and entrepreneurship at the University of Colorado, Denver, sharing his knowledge and expertise with the next generation of healthcare leaders. Laurence's diverse experiences and deep understanding of healthcare innovation makes him a perfect guest for our podcast as we explore the challenges and opportunities in this rapidly evolving field. So without further ado, let's dive into our conversation with Laurence Freeman. Welcome.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Ty.
We'll just dig in and talk about maybe Oakbay and intellectual property commercialization a bit. And before we dig in, how would you define intellectual property in the healthcare industry? When a lot of us think about intellectual property, you see it in the news. I think the most recent thing that was in the news was Ed Sheeran getting sued for copying Marvin Gaye's guitar line. And there's so much more to it. So what can and cannot be considered intellectual property in the healthcare space? And like I said, just what is it in general?
To answer the first part of your question, there are four components to intellectual property across the globe. There are trade secrets. Think of the Coca-Cola recipe, which has been a trade secret for over 100 years. There are patents, design patents, utility patents. There are trademarks, and there are copyrights. So trade secrets are, as I've explained, a patent is basically an application that you've made with in America, the USPTO, United States Patent and Trademark Office. And if it's approved legally, that is a claim of ownership for the patent holder. Any infringement by a third party on your proprietary information, which is protected by a patent, basically that third party is liable for action against them. Then trademarks, and I'm bringing Coca-Cola into the equation here, something I don't drink, by the way. And it's the name Coca-Cola, the design of it, the font of the words, the color of it. In fact, you'll always see TM next to it. That's a trademark, or RM, R as a registered trademark. Trademarks last a long time, as long as you pay the renewal fee. Give you an example, it's not just names that you can trademark. You can trademark a scent. Think of Play-Doh. Play-Doh has actually a certain scent about it, a certain smell. That is trademark. Nobody can copy it. Then there is if you ever go into the lobby of a West End hotel, each and every West End hotel has that same aroma. Very nice, very pleasant smell. That is trademarked. So nobody else can use it. The brown Pantone of a UPS truck, that is trademarked. Nobody else can use it. So trademarks do last a long time, like trade secrets. Patents, however, don't last as long. A utility patent lasts typically 20 years from the date you actually file it. And then a design patent will last for 15 years from the day you file it. And then there are plant patents as well that also have a good life. I believe it's 10 years, that if you create a new flower or a new plant, you can actually take out a patent on it. And then the last category is copyrights. Now, copyrights are quite unique because they cover several categories as proprietary ownership, whether it be a book, whether it be a work of art, i.e. a painting or digital art, a song, as we mentioned before, with Ed Sheeran infringing, did you say Stevie Wonder?
Marvin Gaye.
Marvin Gaye's lyric or music?
It was actually his guitar line.
Music, yeah, that's a copyright infringement. Copyrights Generally speaking, I always call them the best bang for the buck because they're so little in cost to file in the US, $65. So if you ever read a paperback book, I still do, and I'm sure others do, and you open up the front cover and then inside there's all the information about the publisher, you'll always see with a circle around it and the date it was actually the copyright was filed. In the US, you file them with a federal body called the Library of Congress, not the USPTO, but the Library of Congress handles copyrights. And they're great because they last a long time.
That was awesome. Yeah, thank you for that explanation. And so going into the healthcare innovation side, how do you see the role of intellectual property management in particular in healthcare innovation? And really, what is its significance for entrepreneurial clinicians and physicians?
It's key. It's all about ownership of innovation. And if you don't want to take out intellectual property on it, and it's a very good innovation, and it starts to be a commercial success, it only takes any company in the world to see this, fall on their radar, so to speak, and then they would be investigating through the obvious channels of the databases of intellectual property that exist in WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Office, covers a lot of countries in the world. You do a search on that for the name of the company or the name of the product and how it works. And it's quite amazing how quickly they will find that nothing exists that protects the owner of that innovation. So the reality is they could take that innovation, either reverse engineer it or just copy it, take out a patent, bang, they own it. Because the first to file of any intellectual property that's copyright, trademark, patents, even the trade secret, you're not filing, but the first one to file in those three categories I've mentioned always wins the intellectual property law. It's key that if you want to maintain ownership and you either can just keep it, I've met people, a lot of engineers who create innovations, file the patents, and then just park it on the shelf. There are companies here, IP lawyers here in town, who've got a lot of shelves with a lot of patented innovations that just sat there. Nobody really wants to take. The reality is you must protect your innovation.
Absolutely. And where, I guess, along the commercialization process is intellectual property management most important? And at what point in the process would a company start working with a company like Oakbay?
Okay, so I often tell people I'm the first man in and the last man out. So basically what happens is that somebody comes with an innovation, and what you need is a strategy built to protect it. But the first thing you need to do is do an intellectual property search to make sure that this innovation is original. So you're looking at originality. And once you've established originality, then you can go down the various channels, the 4 channels that I've mentioned, depending on the innovation, and look at what is needed to offer protection to the innovator. Then obviously it's a choice, but at the end of the process, when the patents have been filed, that's it. The day they're filed, the protection of that innovation starts. Obviously, time is taken in terms of a patent. It may be 2 years before the examiner reviews it. And if it's approved, then the innovator wholly owns that innovation. So in terms of being the last man out, what happens is that when we're creating the strategy, I always ask the innovator, okay, so if everything goes through, what do you want to do with your innovation? There are choices. There are operations, i.e., I'm going to build a business and make them and sell them. Should it be a med device? Or I'm going to sell the intellectual property, or I want to license the intellectual property. There are different ways to do that. Selling a patent is like selling a car, selling a house. So that comes at the end of the process. What I don't do is help with operations. That's outside my wheelhouse these days.
Could you speak to the strategy of as far as worldwide patent rights versus just staying within the US? Because there's like a five-fold cost increase, and how you go about your provisional patent strategy impacts your worldwide patent rights. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think you underestimated 5 times US. It's typically, I've heard of, depends on how many countries you want to file it, of course. If you've just spent perhaps $10,000, including filing fees for the US application, realistically, if you want a full global coverage, or not complete, but a good coverage across the globe, start thinking of 100,000 upwards. Yeah, saw the eyebrows go up there, Ty. So, but that's the truth. Realistically, filing for a US patent is something that you could do very quickly and initially. And once you get that submitted, because then you have your filing date there. So what usually happens in the US is you file, and it's quite unique to the US, you file a provisional patent application, acronym PPA. So that is actually very low cost, but compared to a full patent application. So in the US, and this is not available in most other countries, you file that patent, inexpensive patent, it stays invisible to everybody in the world. It's not even looked at by the examiners, but it's a date line in the sand. In that period of time, you're working on your innovation. You might want to do a few modifications to improve it. And then at 11 months and 2 weeks, you file a full patent application in the US. And then on the back of that, you can file in other countries as well, because all the patent applications are consistent with each other, almost like mirror images, and be able to file your $100,000 worth of patent applications. It goes up, of course, if there are any challenges and the attorney takes time to answer the examiners.
Someone's going to have to raise millions of venture capital prior to even probably going through this process, because if you're talking 100,000 just for this alone, and then you have the lawyer fees and you're paying everybody on the team, I can imagine all of this starts to get pretty pricey.
I would say that the savvy startup entrepreneur, number one, they will bootstrap everything. I always joke that they'll bootstrap themselves so tight that they'll cut off the blood supply to their feet. And then a lot of people don't realize that intellectual property is so important. I have my saying of the 5 mantras of the investor. In order of importance, number 1 is intellectual property. You own it. If you don't own it, the investor would say, why would I invest in you? It might be stolen by somebody else. Number 2, management. People invest in people. They're looking for stellar management. Number 3 is your audience, who is going to buy it and monetize and repay the investors at the desired time. Number 4 is your product. Now, product being so far down the list is significant to take notice of, because if you have a product that is okay, but you have number 2, stellar management, they will make that product stellar, not the other way around. And then number 5 is barriers to entry. So if you imagine all these 5 components being in a circle, starting at 1 at the top and then finishing with 5 next to number 1, intellectual property is a key barrier to entry. So the startup entrepreneur would find out and follow those mantras of the investor if they do require investor funding. Some people are self-funded, and things can look very different from that perspective.
So essentially, that's one of the first investments you're going to make as an early stage startup. But I guess on the flip side, you have worked with Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies. And so how does this strategy that you're talking about change for companies that essentially have just access to far more capital right from the get-go?
Obviously, they're not looking at investor funding. What they're really counting on is that they typically, a larger Fortune 100 company will have in-house intellectual property attorneys. Let's take IBM, for example. I was told by an overseas IBM employee that they have a intellectual property attorney team. Don't know how many's in the team, but what I do know is that they file 100 patents every day of the week.
Wow.
And if you were to do any statistics, you can just look up at Google, that they are one of the largest intellectual property owners in the world. I'm not going to say the largest because there are some that are not disclosed and they file through subsidiaries. So it gets fragmented and you can't always tell accurately what's happening. But IBM is always up there with the most patent application approval, typically every year.
Dialing it back just a little bit, I forgot to ask you about Oakbay as well. And what inspired you to start Oakbay as a company? What kind of companies do you work with? What kind of products have you guys commercialized?
Well, let's start at the beginning. So, beginning of the timeline, I created Oakbay based on something that happened within my family from the late 1980s, 1990s, where a family member in the UK created great innovation and made my father's brother, my uncle, would tell me about his son, my cousin, how he thought his son was going to be a multi-millionaire. And he went on for this maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years, I can't remember. But what happened was that he didn't become a multimillionaire because it wasn't protected with intellectual property. And a research laboratory in another part of the world found out what it was and created the improved version using the basis of what my cousin had created as that. And they patented theirs, and that was it. Game over. So that story, my uncle was heartbroken, and that story never left me. And an opportunity came up in 2013, and I thought, I'll just investigate this. And I took some time off and did my due diligence. I was back here in Denver, and I decided, number one, I'm going to stick with healthcare. So I had a lot of lifelong experience. All my working life I've worked in healthcare. And number two, I'd done enough research to find out who was doing what and what did I have competition? Yes, but did I have as much competition? I thought there might be. IBM wasn't one of my competitors because they did everything in-house. I was going to do it for outside clients. In 2014, I decided that I would do a soft launch just to make sure that I wasn't talking to people like IBM who thought I was talking nonsense, accents aside. And then I formed my company, Oakbay, in 2015. The reason I picked Oakbay is that when you're picking a new name of a company, you can spend a lot of time going through Google and other search engines to try and find something original. And I spent a couple of days doing this, and all variables of Oakbay is actually the area that I lived in when I lived in British Columbia, Canada. It's on Vancouver Island. And lo and behold, as one word, Oakbay was two words there. Oakbay, it was like, the hallelujah moment arrived. And 10 minutes later, and I think it was $50. That was mine. That was a big relief, actually. That was one of the biggest reliefs of the process, because whilst you have a business idea, if you haven't got a name for your company, it's difficult to jump off the starting block. So that's how that's how Oakbay evolved, was born. And then I moved into 2015. I spent a lot of time networking to find out who was of value in the specific med device and pharma, and looking at the nanotech connection with it. But gradually, through my network, I realized that pharma was very difficult to do it. But what put me off with pharma was the timeline from innovation to monetary fruition. And you can go through 15, 16 years. However, in year 12 or year 13, it might fail the class 3 trials, clinical trials. So I decided if I get involved with that, I may not be alive long enough to see how these actually, if they mature and come to fruition. I made an executive decision to stay away from pharma, and for the duration of the process anyway, and then stuck with medDevice, which is more of a shorter timeline. And when I got to know how things worked on the med device side, I enjoyed that. I worked with a very nice gentleman called Tom Schilling, who is a very competent FDA regulatory and compliance gentleman. I networked with Dr. Arlen Myers, who's been one of your guests, also a personal friend of mine, as is Tom. And we do a lot of cross-pollination in the networking and introductory field. On the med device side, as there is a timeline because there's originality, there is objectivity, proof of concept, doing all the trials. And if there is a 510K requirement, then there is the FDA journey. However, what I did find out through Tom, and I don't know whether many people in the audience will know this, but if you were to do an FDA application, typically there is maybe 9 months to 18 months in that timeline. You can, if you have an extra $8,000 to $10,000 available, there are companies out there that once you have completed that application, you can actually submit it to one of those companies and they will check every letter of every word of every sentence of every paragraph in that application to make sure that it is 100% perfect. Typically takes 2 weeks. You get it back, you submit it to the FDA. Tom told me that the fastest he's ever had one approved was 19 days. But you have to have that $8,000 to $10,000 at the front end, which is actually faster than when created the fast track FDA compliance during the time of the COVID pandemic. You get to know these things by networking. Some of the projects that I brought to help monetize Ladies Health, 2 med devices there. I can't say too much because I still have valid non-disclosure agreements on these. And when you're in Denver, you don't want to burn your reputation.
Absolutely.
Or anywhere for that matter. The biggest, hardest part of any of this, especially in the digital healthcare world, is getting the proof of concept, the trials. Because when you submit them, say digital healthcare, you need a hospital, either an individual hospital or hospital network, to try it out for you to make sure it works. And the actual process, timeline process of ringing that doorbell, sitting down at the table with the people that make the decisions, providing you've got the right people at the beginning, and then waiting for them to say yes or no, could take 6 months doing that. And in that 6-month period, nobody knows that this is going on and there's new innovations piling. So digital health is actually a very challenging situation to get proof of concept.
I can imagine that. You could expose yourself to some level of risk during that period of time to get out competed. And sure enough, something hits market and you're like, oh dear. And we're still in our trial phase.
That's the point. Yeah. The hardest part is that if you've applied for a patent and it's been approved and there's been somebody else out there that didn't apply for a patent but created a trade secret strategy before your patent, and you get there and you're sat around the table with the CMO, the CFO, the CIO, the CEO, and you're telling your audience there how everything is so fantastic with your innovation. It's the best thing that's ever happened. This will be so wonderful for you. And they will tell you, well, we've been using that for a year.
Oh, God.
And it's like,
devastating.
and you might have done your due diligence to
Yeah.
do the research for originality. This is what happens with a trade secret.
Yeah, it's very sneaky. It sneaks up on you. We did get an interesting question in the Q&A, and I think we should address it. So she says,
Sure.
Engineers, we're constantly innovating and creating new solutions, as you mentioned. And how do we recognize when something is both novel and worth pursuing for IP?
So there are 2 categories here that I want to briefly mention. If she's an employer, she has her own company and she has people working for her as engineers. Typically in their employment agreement, there is non-disclosure, non-compete, non-circumvent, and basically any intellectual property that's created with those criteria in their employment agreement typically belongs to the company. Now, it depends on the company as to how it's worded. There's one particular example I know of where This particular person works for a company, very large company, privately owned company, 4 billion a year in revenues. And he works as the innovator. He is the inventor on the patent application. And once the patent has been approved, or not approved, but let's talk about approved. The company own it exclusively for 5 years, and then they can transfer ownership to the inventor after that 5-year point. In some cases, that's very unusual, but it's a very large company and they're great with their employees. There is another type where the company will own it forevermore or for the life of the intellectual property. And there are other companies in their agreement where there may be a joint ownership, innovator and employer. There are different ways that cake becomes. So as an employee, Connie will have signed an employee agreement. Obviously, whatever's in the employee agreement will clearly state on paragraph titled Innovation and Intellectual Property. It's hard for me to know what the direct answer will be, but there are variables of an answer.
Maybe one way we could, she's as an employee, but also if you could touch on maybe worth pursuing for IP as a business consideration, because filing for a patent and getting a patent awarded isn't necessarily a market signal that it will be a commercial success.
That's true. But if you, as an employee, you work somewhere, even as a student in a university system, you come up with an innovation. And there was one here in Colorado. I can't remember which school it was, whether it was Denver or Boulder. Somebody came up with an innovation and he filed his intellectual property and it was approved. He went into business with it and he made some really good money with it. And 2 years later, after starting business, he got a phone call. Congratulations. This is the Colorado Tech Transfer Office.
Ooh.
And we're so pleased with you. And we saw from the write-up that gave the history that you were a student of ours. And while you were a student of ours, you created this innovation. Oh, we're so happy for you. By the way, you owe us 75% of every dollar you've made profit.
Yep. Yeah. We had a very similar instance happen. Actually, I had a radio show in college and there was a huge record label that kind of got birthed out of that radio station in college. Ooh. And once they found out about this label and their success, same thing happened. They got a phone call. They got actually a lawsuit involved in it. And they got their money. The loss held up after all. And ever since that, I remember them even telling us, like, if you're going to pursue anything that comes out of this, name it something different, whatever it is, call it something else, because you want to, if you have your community here, that's fine. But if you're actually going to name it the same thing and carry it forward after birthing it here in college or within the school, you're in trouble.
That's right. In Colorado, they're stricter still, because if you use any on-campus equipment like a 3D printer or a laser pen or anything that belongs to the college, you're in the 75-25 crowd.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Do it in your dorm room. Oof. Yeah, you're there. 75-25.
Each university has their unique IP agreement. I think NC State has a very favorable one. So it almost becomes a recruiting component of this. If you're going to create something, then how good is the tech transfer office at not just rent-seeking behavior, but actually supporting the entrepreneurial efforts of the students? If you wouldn't mind circling back to novelty.
Yes.
And how do you know whether or not the invention is novel? I think you mentioned a patent search, but just maybe you could touch on that.
Yeah, originality. You mean it being original? It would be when I do a search for originality. A patent search is normally your start point, and you do a global patent search because, again, as I mentioned earlier, people do innovation engineers. A lot of engineers do innovative work and get them patented, and if they're approved, obviously it's there to see, but they don't do anything with it. You might never know that your innovation that you actually want to go to market with belongs to somebody else, but they've never gone to market with it. So effectively, I do global patent searches, I do trademark searches, and then I do FDA searches for an American one. There was an example of a ladies' health innovation that came up that wasn't patented and wasn't trademarked in any way. I do copyright searches as well. And then I thought, I'm going to do an FDA search because this particular process will need FDA approval. And lo and behold, I found it
There
out
it
of a
was.
company in Australia that never applied for a patent, and they were doing the identical thing that this company had on the market without FDA compliance. However, the process was identical because what I found was they were doing this by mail order. And they had an agent here in America, and I found the cease and desist letter.
Oh,
And when we looked at this product and the way the process and everything was, we effectively reversed engineering. There was no workaround for what could be done for this particular innovation. So potentially to avoid any conflict of interest, the innovator threw her hands up and said, I'm going to think of something else. Doing the search is not just the patent search, because you just never know. I always do an FDA search and a CE search, because not everybody applies for FDA and CE, or CE and FDA.
very interesting. I do think we have, was it 18 minutes left? Maybe we should pivot over a little bit, talk data science in healthcare and decubed technology. So maybe if you could tell us a bit about your role as the co-founder, CEO of Technologies and its relation to the healthcare industry.
Decube Technologies started off as I was one of 4 partners. I'm now one of 2 partners. And we did actually start off in the healthcare space to create a program to deduplicate electronic healthcare records. Duplicate healthcare records are almost, in the US, are almost a secret, undesirable secret, principally because there is $22 billion a year in waste of duplicated healthcare records.
Wow.
Of expenses. There is the famous story that took place in Texas of, I think there were 12 Maria Gonzalez's registered in 12 different provider facilities with the same name, same date of birth, and same social security number. But ironically, each Maria Gonzalez with that profile looked different. So every single one was an individual person using the original number 1 Maria Gonzalez's number. It was a big Medicare fraud, and that's how that came to light. It was the actual name that was used. She was, the first one was the real Maria Gonzalez. And so basically what happens is if they've already been paid by an insurance company or Medicare, they have to refund that money because a fraud has taken place and they can't be paid for a fraudulent transaction. So it costs the provider community billions of dollars. Usually they're small increments, but I know that the Mayo Clinic reported up to over $200,000 on one record that they had to refund. There's nothing you can do. Your patients had the service gone away. You bill the insurance company, get paid, and then there's a whoops, and there's not a solitary thing you can do about it. So we set up shop to do that. What happened was the healthcare systems in America, for good reasons, HIPAA compliance, are paranoid about outside providers coming in to deduplicate their EHRs. Obviously, the consequences of breaching HIPAA are severe, not just for ourselves, but for the hospital systems in general. So it was very hard to gain traction with that idea. So what we did was I think pivot is the new word. We repositioned ourselves as a company, and we now do, using machine learning, artificial intelligence, we do intellectual property tracking. So what we look at is people who have, say, a copyright. It's very big in the copyright industry, especially in the music side. Patents, trademarks. You can track if somebody, a client has a registered trademark and they want it to keep eyes and ears on their competition that might be stealing their intellectual property. We can do the tracking on that. And that's actually a relatively new project. So effectively, I wouldn't say that we've moved out of healthcare completely, because there's a lot of healthcare people who've got intellectual property. So we could actually accommodate those as well. And therefore, we don't have to go into their software systems. So that's where we're at with Decube. Kept the name the same.
Wonderful. Thank you. Just sticking on the side of healthcare innovation, what do you really feel like the value of, or the importance of, high quality data in healthcare innovation? And what impact do you think it really has on AI-driven solutions for entrepreneurial clinicians and physicians?
I was thinking about this earlier today because I had an idea you were going to ask me that question. So I would say that algorithms have been around for centuries, and it's been very useful to use them mainstream yesterday and today. I had outside of healthcare, I had a project done for a marketing project for a Scandinavian company. So I don't just deal with healthcare, who were launching their product in the US for the first time. And a company that was geographically close to where I'm sat now, they did an artificial intelligence project for me that incorporated and created a marketing campaign that brought 1,000 people, or slightly more than 1,000 visitors, to their exhibition booth at CES on day one. And this company was completely unknown. So doing that process and understanding how it worked, the key, and I had to give a list of 24 publications of where this made, not social media ones, not the Twitter one or the Facebook or anything like that, just 24 publications over a period of 4 years prior to when the last CES show was going to take place. And so we were back in 2011, and they were scanning through everything and looking for keywords, and it produced a fantastic result. It was a big win. And in healthcare, you can have terrific win. However, algorithms aren't necessarily unique, I found out. A lot of them are open source, and you can use an open source algorithm very inexpensively. I understand there's like a library of these open source algorithms, and you can use them very effectively. However, if they're there in the library, okay, you look at them. Can I use it? No. Okay, let's look at another one. So they're not essentially unique. There are some custom made ones, don't get me wrong, but they do a great job providing the data is scrubbed right at the very beginning to be clean. Otherwise, you end up with garbage in, garbage out. And therefore, the whole process is inaccurate.
Yeah, Ty and I have seen that as well, as with us messing around with tools like ChatGPT and stuff like that. If your input is bad, your output is also going to be equally as bad.
Exactly. Now, there's the opportunity, really, and I've spoken to somebody about this, is going to ChatGPT input school.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. So what does excite me actually in the technology world, and this fell on my radar last September, quantum computing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So with AI providing it's clean and using quantum computing, instead of taking days, you're looking at minutes.
That's incredible. I've even heard about quantum computing being a threat to like blockchain technology and like the encryption data that's out there. The fact that quantum computing can eventually solve these encryptions like really quickly. And it's just not a matter of if, but when it gets strong enough to do so.
Yeah. I have a connection in Finland, and quantum computing is massive there. January of this year, they started, especially in the healthcare world, they're in America now. Microsoft has got it. They've just teamed up. It was announced yesterday, I think, with Moderna, the pharma company, for their, not ChatGPT, for their quantum computing.
Very interesting.
And that caught my attention. That, I believe, is something. Quantum computing is going to make timelines so short that if you think about, say, an innovation in the pharmaceutical world and using quantum computing to aid the process, it's really going to bring a lot of products to market much quicker.
That actually aligns with a question I had for you as well, which was just talking about, would you say that the healthcare innovation space is more competitive now than it was earlier in your career? And also, do you think it's easier and faster to innovate these, with the tools and resources available to early stage startups?
Absolutely. I grew up with pen and paper. And when you wanted to find out something, you had to go to the library, unless you had a set of Encyclopedia Britannica from the UK. So you had to go to the library and do the research and look through the microfiche or look through the volumes of books. And if you couldn't find it in one library, you'd go to the next library, which was bigger, like the Central Library in Leeds, which is where I was born and raised. And now, today, here we are, 2023, I can look at something while you and I are talking. But there's always downsides to whatever there is, but innovation is it's mainstream now.
Totally.
Yeah, and especially cloud computing has made it so where if you want to set up an e-commerce site and it just happens in minutes now compared
Yes.
to the lengthy time period it used to take to get something set up, get the coding figured out and everything. All of those connections are well-traveled pathways for
Yeah.
a lot of different categories, where once before you had to set up a server, try to figure out where to host it and get your domain name and all of that. It's just so much easier today.
Yeah, I know that. I remember some of the startups, technology startups that you would read about in the early 2000s, where they had their servers in the closet of their parents' home spare bedroom. There are lots of stories like that, where people start a startup in their bedroom. And by the way, I've got a nice, that humming noise that you can hear all night is the server.
Yeah. Keeping you up all night.
Yeah, but if the stigma of being an innovator has disappeared, it's a much more respected profession, I'm going to call it, industry. Innovation, say in the last century, 1940s, 1950s, people were thought of being eccentric or being weird. And the innovation today is mainstream, almost expected.
Yeah, sure is. I think we see it in the news. We see it anywhere you look, essentially. Everyone wants to be an innovator, entrepreneur as well. And I think on that note, we're pretty close to time here. And we have so many more questions to ask you. So I think we may have to have you on again at some point.
Okay, sure. Yeah. In conclusion,
yeah,
things our grandchildren, great-grandchildren will say, hey, do you remember the time when grandpa had to put gasoline in the car to make it go? That's an analogy that we're living in a transition age, but it's continually transitioning. And I would say specifically in healthcare, for the better. If you look at the mortality rates, you look at the data, the mortality rates and how people are not dying. Most cancers can be cured. Not all, but most. 30 years ago, you got cancer, good night. I hate to say it, but today that's innovation.
It's incredible, and it's happening faster than ever before. Like how you said, we're in one of these transitional periods in human history, essentially, and I think it's really exciting for all of us. But yeah, Laurence, we're coming up on time. We just really thank you for your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to come back if you answer the rest of those questions. You can throw in a few more. We'll sort that out as well.
No, definitely. So yeah, just once again, thank you so much. And for everyone that's listening,
you're welcome.
You can connect with Laurence on LinkedIn and talk to him about Oakbay LLC or D-Cubed, or work with him on any of his innovation projects that he's got at the moment. And we'll see this on Spotify, YouTube, and also TikTok. So find us there.
Oh, good. TikTok. I'll have to create an account.
We'll tag you in it. And like I said, everybody that joined us today, thank you so much.
Thank you. And if anybody wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, please do, and mention that you heard me in this podcast, and then I'll know how you found me.